Everybody, welcome. We'll just wait a moment for everybody to get in. We've got rather a lot of you coming tonight, so wonderful to see your faces. Hi there, hello. Lots of old friends, lots of new faces. Great, okay, well, welcome to Animate Earth. Thank you for deciding to spend time with us this evening or today, this morning, whatever time zone you're in. We are really delighted to have with us tonight Colin Campbell, who is one of the founders of Animate Earth. So tonight I get to interview him, which I think I've hardly ever done before. So really looking forward to that. Just to let you know what the format's going to be, we are going to talk for about 40 minutes. And then we will throw the floor open for questions. So you're welcome to use the chat as we go along, but if you have questions that you'd really like to have answered, if you could wait to ask them when we open it up, so we've just got more chance of catching them as they come up. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Colin, but just to give him a little bit more introduction. I've known Colin for many, many years and have been working with him, teaching, speaking, doing ceremony, ritual for most of that time. Colin, you were taught and initiated by the elders of some of the oldest, most sacred and magical traditions in Southern Africa. And you are now one of the lineage holders for that tradition. And I know that a lot of your work has been about bringing some of the wisdom and the processes of that tradition into a Western context, which is why it's so interesting to hear you speak about it. So we're here tonight to talk about ritual. And I think, as we said at the outset, so many of us see what's happening in the world at the moment, and we wonder what it is that we might do. Sometimes the very obvious, mechanical, logical, rational things are not the things that we feel able to do or that are the work in the world. So I would love to ask you about ritual and how you see that as a different way of working in the world that has potency and effect really for our times. So ritual, from your lineage, Colin, what would you say that means?
Thank you, Rachel, just greetings to everybody here. It's just amazing to see all these faces in front of me in this continually strange environment that we call virtuality these days. So I always find myself a bit blown away by it, sitting in front of my little square, or at least oblong machine here, and yet here we all are connecting. So in a certain sense, there's a kind of rituality to all that as well. Yeah, so I mean, where I generally like to start with these things is always, the words we choose to describe things. What we tend to do in English as a language is we have words that describe huge vistas of activity, but don't describe them very well, and are quite unable to really specify what the meaning of the word is. So in English, we have this word ritual, which covers a host of possibilities in terms of meaning. In the traditions here in Southern Africa, we don't have really a word for ritual. So we have different things that we do or that are done. and they all have their own particular names and their own particular ways of being described within those names. So to have this generic word ritual is a little bit of it complexifies the situation, and it takes us away, I think, to some extent from a really clear understanding of what it is we're talking about when we use the word ritual. So I'm going to, although we use the word ritual here, I'm going to try and weave my way around it rather than through it, and not attempt so much to define it as just to speak around this general subject and try and bring a bit of an illumination to what we're specifically talking about when we speak here. The first thing to say is that there are certain basic notions to this idea. And one of the basic notions is we are here, human beings, having this phenomenological experience called existence. And that's a perplexing business for the most part. And always, I think, has been. Who are we? How do we come to be here? More importantly, even than that, why are we here? Is there a purpose? And these are the core existential questions that we all ask. And we have had different ways of engaging with them through the process of being human. But the way I like to start is to start by saying, no matter who we are, no matter where we are, no matter how we understand ourselves, primarily the way we understand ourselves and the way we understand the world around us is encoded in what we call the creation story that we belong to. So every culture, every collective has had and continues to have, if they still exist, a creation story. And the creation story basically details in mythic form, which is taken as being the kind of basic fact of our existence, even though we call it mythic form, the route that we've come as human beings from the very beginning to where we find ourselves now. And in many cases, some attempt to explain where we're going, and from that to derive meaning, to derive a sense of why all of this exists. So if we imagine back, we imagine into our own history through our own creation story in the Western world, in Western culture, Western industrialized culture, we have this notion that once upon a time, perhaps somewhere here in Southern Africa, we lived in a biome as creatures deeply immersed in the cycles and functions of nature. And at some point, and I'm encapsulating this massively here, we stood on our hind legs, we reticulated our thumbs, we were able to pick up objects, we gathered a functional knowledge of tools, we left the forest regions that we lived and walked out onto the plains. And at some point, and this is the critical point, we gathered the capacity to carry fire and brought fire into our way of operating as human beings. And all the old stories say the same thing about this. They say, when we gathered fire, everything changed. Absolutely everything changed. So traditional people here say in the stories of this part of the world, that when we harnessed fire, in a sense, we stole fire. And this is another motif that is very common in indigenous cultures all over the world, that we stole fire, that we weren't really meant to have it, and yet we stole it, and that changed us forever. And the Creator looked upon this and said, listen, this is not good. You've stolen fire, and now you're going to have to change your relationship with the rest of creation. Fundamentally, by having fire, by having stolen it, you have separated yourself from creation. And now you're going to be tasked with two things. One, taking on the responsibility of the implications of that. And two, finding ways of reconnecting back to what you've separated yourself from. And so we left our biome, as our cultural story tells us, enabled by the fact that we had fire. We could leave our biome and we could spread out across the earth. and find ourselves in territories and places which were completely different from the one that we'd been used to, right up into the Arctic regions and into desert regions and into some of the most uninhabitable regions theretofore that we could imagine. And each time we did, we were tasked with trying to figure out how to survive in these places and what survival entailed. And we developed our particular laws in the LORE sense of how that could happen. So I would say to you that probably the most fundamental basis of this word ritual, from the point of view of where I sit here now, here in Southern Africa, and from the route that I've come, is the question, how do we reconnect back into what we have isolated ourselves from? And the creation stories are have large tracts of their narrative dedicated to this question. And I'm going to say to you that I would think that one of the primary words that describe the means and the practices by which we have developed, or that we have developed essentially in order to reestablish this connection, we could loosely call ritual. So what that means is essentially we've found ways. We've said, to reconnect, these are the things we can do. And the question, first of all, well, what are we reconnecting to? So in our earliest ancestry, we would say, well, we're reconnecting into the nature we've left behind. We're refinding ourselves within a deeply, fundamentally connected place within the natural world. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we observe. We look at the world and we at the world around us, and we observe how it works. And we find that the sun rises in the east and circles around and settles in the west. We find that winds blow from the different directions. We find that the moon also has this east-west trajectory and grows at certain times and diminishes again, and then is reborn and grows and diminishes. We find that water flows in particular directions in particular ways and so on. And we understand also through this that everything somehow is cyclic, that it has a circular form to it. And we also describe that in terms of, so when we gather as people, let's say we light a fire, which is kind of a symbol of commune, of coming together as humans, particularly because we have this thing called fire, and we gather around it. What immediately we recognize is that we're gathering around it. There's a circularity to it. And so the circle has become one of the oldest ways of describing in symbolic form our connection to each other, to ourselves, and to the rest of creation. So the circle is therefore a fundament of all these practices. So you could say that just about every practice that we've had that relates to this thing called ritual has in some ways been constructed around this idea of the circle. So the circle as connection, the circle as container, the circle as cycle, the circle as the generation of life, death, rebirth, life, death, rebirth, and in a sense, that's the fundament of what we're working with when we talk about ritual. So we're looking at these fundamental patterns in the phenomenological experience of being alive, of existing, and we're saying, okay, how do we bring those into an integrated awareness within ourselves? And then we have another question. To what extent do we have a participatory agency in relation to all these cycles? Do we have some agency in the questions of life and death beyond the mere functions of survival? And how do we how do we cultivate? How do we strengthen? How do we build connection? Recognizing that connection is the fundamental way that the cohering cosmos, or at least that the cosmos coheres, that it comes into a state of interactive wholeness. And what we have believed, it seems, in pretty much every culture, right from the very beginning, up until relatively recently, is that we had a profound role to play in the coherence of interconnectedness, not just among ourselves, but in the cosmos as a whole. That in some way we had a role in terms of how this interconnectivity took place, and that we had a responsibility to it as well. And so we developed practices that we would perform in order to feed into and assist this coherence of connection. And equally at the same time, to consistently bring ourselves back into an inextricable connection with creation itself, so that we felt once again a part of, a dynamic part of. And by dynamic, I mean that there is an interaction between us and creation itself, and that's a continuing process that's happening. In other words, the moon doesn't remotely gather itself each month, come to its fullness, diminish, disappear, and then be reborn the following month to go through the same cycle. That's not a remote thing. That's something that is deeply intimate to who we are. And traditional people would say it's something which in some way depends on us at some level, in the same sense that it depends on everything else. Everything is interdependent. These are ideas that we have turfed out of our modernity quite a long time ago now. We see, for example, the cycles of the moon, the movements of the sun, the nature of the cosmos itself, the functionings of nature as somehow separate from us, as somehow objectified, something outside of who we are. That wasn't true before. And no matter what culture you look into prior to our current view, and I would say to that our current view of our relationship with the cosmos is pretty much unprecedented. But when you look into it, what you find is that there is this inextricable and intimate interactive relationship with everything. The movements of the moon, the movements of the sun, the movements of the winds, the movements of waters, the movements of forests and animals, and everything that is seemingly other than us is in fact intimately part of who we are. And it's important to consistently maintain a dynamic relationship, a dynamic engagement with that. So I would say that this is the basis of ritual. Certainly in the traditions that I've been lucky enough to be part of here in Southern Africa, and those that I've come across in other places as well, it's a way in which we dynamically are part of creation and are interacting into creation as creators ourselves. And we develop out of that specific methodologies to do that, using circularity as the primary sense around how we order ourselves. So our sense of the cosmos, our sense of the cycles that go on within that cosmos, the cycles that go on within our own internality, our biophysical internality, our psychic internality, our psychospiritual internality, and so on, are all circular in nature. And so our practices are arranged in terms of that circularity. And the circle is at the absolute heart of it. And then within that and around that, we create practices. We create practices that turn things on. We create practices that switch things off. We create practices that amplify things. We create practices that diminish things. We create practices that contain things, that exclude things, that include things. So all of this, in all its different ways, you can, in a sense, put within this term ritual. But there is an addition I want to put into place here as well. And that is that you could say that on one level, certainly according to the English word ritual is a kind of it's a repeated habit. It's something we do every day. We clean our teeth every day, for example, or we drive to work every day, or we have a cup of coffee at 7 o'clock each morning. You could say these are rituals. I would want to take that and separate it to some extent for the time being, just for the sake of what we're saying here, and say that what we're really talking about when we talk about ritual here is something slightly different, in the sense that if we are deeply and inextricably connected to creation, what we recognize is that we are part of something that is vast and that is much vaster than who I locally am here. And that everything I do, in some sense, is in service to that vast, to that whole, to that totality. And it's this particular relationship that I would say leads to the notion of so-called sacred ritual. So sacred ritual basically recognizes that I am part of something so much bigger, and that I am, in a sense, encumbered with the requisite, if you like, of feeding into that in a creative way, and of somehow being a co-builder in that totality. That's sacred ritual.
Wow, so a million questions occur to me, Colin. Perhaps the most urgent one is this kind of idea of if we hold responsibility for somehow keeping this balance or keeping this conversation going, I imagine there was a time in all of our ancestry when that would just have been a natural thing to do. But in contemporary times, obviously, there are different rituals now being used in different parts of the world, but so few of them are probably done with that kind of deep understanding that this is a conversation with the world. We've kind of boxed into the kind of different entities that we might be having conversations with. So kind of what happens because we haven't held this kind of sacred conversation, and how do we begin to kind of restore that in a way that has meaning in our times and all over the world? What would be your recommendation? Sorry.
Well, So I mean, in order to even talk to that, one of the things we have to recognize and begin to grapple with is the manner in which our psychic representation of who we believe ourselves to be has changed. It's changed dramatically in a relatively short space of time. So if you can imagine, there's a very long space of time that we've been human, in which we've seen ourselves in one way, and a relatively short, in fact, pretty much an infinitesimally short period of time in which we've seen ourselves in a completely different way. So very broadly, we could differentiate this as a collective view of ourselves versus an individualistic view of ourselves. So a collective view of ourselves was very much, and what I have to say before I even say any more about that is it's extremely difficult for us, from the context within which we find ourselves now, the individualistic view of ourselves, to comprehend a lot of how we were in our collective nature. So when we look into our ancestry and we look into those times of our collective nature, what we tend to do is we tend to project our individualistic view of creation onto that. And what that does is it changes it in such a way that we're not really seeing what we were anymore. We're seeing a projection of what we are now projected onto a so-called ancestry. That's a very tricky business. So I suppose the first thing to recognize is that we've created a view of ourselves that is isolating. In other words, I define myself very clearly, and I say, this is who I am, I have a brain, I have a central nervous system, I have a body, and then I have an environment around me. And so there are these concentric circles that go out, if you like, from me, which ultimately result in the totality of my universe. But I'm somehow the epicenter of that. I would suggest to you that this is a new way of seeing ourselves, that at one time we would have seen ourselves as a part of the vastness of creation, as inextricably and undividedly a part of that. And that changes everything in the manner of how we then interact with it. Because for example, if we're going to play with this idea of ritualistic practice, what tends to happen in our modern time is that ritualistic practice becomes focused on the me-ness of my experience. And I speak about me and my, and I feed into that. And the ritual work essentially tends to work with that. How do I improve myself? So a lot of the fundamental precepts of what being modern human has come to mean start to define how I operate. So, for example, our modernity basically hallows the idea of upward motion. In other words, I'm going to overcome, I'm going to grow better, bigger, I'm going to become more, which is more functional, happier, healthier, sadder perhaps, whatever it is. But there's this idea of somewhere out there is the perfection that I seek if I grow enough, if I strive enough, if I am able to overcome enough. So this idea is that in some future point, if I manage to do enough, I will find that perfection. In our collective time, perfection was behind us. So we look back into our ancestry and we look back to the beginning and we say, we came from the totality, we came from completion. And our task is merely to remember that. So our ritual practice would have been very focused on that. It would have been saying, how do we connect back to who we already were? What is it that we relinquish in this seeming separateness to return us to the perfection of our togetherness? So what you see in that is that the fundamental rationale for ritual practice becomes almost reversed. It's a very different way of seeing things to the way we see it now. So in a sense, I think, what we're tasked with right now is working at a very, very deep level to really try and remember what the vast majority of our time spent being human was. And remembering that in a deep existential sense. And part of that means challenging in ourselves the notion that striving, that achievement, and that the deficit thereof is the fundamental motivation for what being human means in the creative sense. Because what that drives ritual into is it drives it into service of the local me. I have to become better. I have to find a way of getting to that perfection. And in doing that, I'm actually what is happening is I'm exacerbating the experience of separateness. So upending that, I suspect, is part of what we're tasked with in this deep question. And that's not an easy business. It's a fully possible business. But how do we do that? Well, we look back into our history and we say, well, what did we used to do? Well, we used to gather in circles as people, and there were certain things that within those collective ways of being that we used to do. Can we begin to start doing them? And not necessarily at this stage have a clear sense of rationale for why we are doing that, recognizing that any rationale we draw for doing those things is going to be drawn from the collective, from the individualistic notion that we have of what being human means now, and which is fundamentally in the end, more separating than it is connecting. So, but what traditional people here say is, you don't need to know why you do this thing. You just look back and you see what the ancestors did, and you do it. And you then see what happens. You do it without any preconceived notion of what it is you're trying to achieve. You saw them gathering in groups and singing at certain times of the month, or you saw them getting into certain positions and praying, or you saw them telling the old myths and stories to each other around fires, or you saw them performing particular gestures to the moon or to the sun, or interacting with nature in particular ways. Try doing these things without recognizing, and you may feel at first that it makes no real sense. And in fact, the less sense it makes at this point in time, probably the better, because the making sense of it is an imposition on it. It's an imposition which, in a sense, will thwart the fundamental purpose behind what it's meant to be doing. So relinquishing that is one of the starting points, and saying, okay, let's just pray. And let's find out how we used to do that. Let's just sing, and let's find out how we used to do that. Are there still cultures which represent that collective way of being that we can learn from? Yes. And we're also still fundamentally connected into that place, actually, even though we've created this illusion of having separated from it. So what I'm going to say to you is that this notion of separation, of course, as all traditions tell us, is an illusion. It's not a reality. It's not the actuality of things. We're no less connected now than we ever were. We have encapsulated ourselves in a notion of disconnection. And so if we begin to perform these practices again, what happens is that what begins to permeate up from within us is a memory of what being connected feels like at a very deep, visceral level. And what then starts happening is the carapace of our illusion begins to crumble, and we begin to experience that collective connectedness once again. And the teachers, most of the people I've worked with here, and I've come across this being said by elders in cultures all over the world, they say, just do the practices. Just do the practices, and don't ask too many questions about them. And one thing that I can say to you from all the time that I've spent in Southern Africa here, which is my whole life, whenever I've gone and I've been doing practices with traditional elders, they never explain to you why you're doing a thing. They will say to you, go and do this, or I'm going to ask you to do that, or participate in this. And you say, but why? And say, don't worry about why, just do it. And then what happens is the explanation, or at least the gnosis, the knowledge, the understanding of why you do it begins to infiltrate you and permeate you, and it supplants the provisional understandings that you might have imposed originally had you been given a rationale up front. And that's a very different experience.
So, Colin, I mean, there are a lot of people here, I would imagine, that do a lot of ritual themselves and lead ritual and ceremony. But I imagine there's also a lot of us that aren't in the position of having elders that can tell us which practices to do. How do we begin? Where do we start? You know, I know a lot of people kind of feel that they would like to do this kind of work, but kind of think, well, I don't have a particular lineage or tradition. My ancestors are in a different place, or there's a mix in my community of different traditions. Where do you start? What are the simple things? You know, is it important? Does it have more potency in a group or as an individual? Where would you start for those people that don't do this kind of work on a regular basis?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you know, I think the first thing to say is that, you know, we are in a culture of dispossessed expertise in this time. What does that mean? It means we've projected the notion of knowing onto everybody else but ourselves. So we go out looking for experts. the idea of an elder isn't necessarily somebody who is going to sit me down and from scratch teach me step by step what it means to practice ritual. Ritual is innate in us. It's fundamental to who we are, even in our present encapsulated place. If we watch children, you'll find that they're performing rituals all the time, and they're ritualizing their world. They're creating meaning, and they're creating inflections in their voices and motions and stances in their bodies that reflect that interconnectedness that still exists in them as children. This gradually gets broken down as we get older, and once we become adults, we've lost that fundamental sense that we have an innate connectedness within us, and we have an innate way of maintaining that connectedness, of increasing it consistently, and of working it through ourselves. So part of it is to just go into the spirit of exploration and saying, okay, listen, there's simple things we can do. We can get together as a group and we can sit in circle, and then we can start speaking from within that and start exploring, seeing what happens. Again, not necessarily having a primary rationale for that, other than that's what we're doing. We're trying that. We can, I've always said that, there are 5 principal things that we should be doing if we're going to lead a healthy psychospiritual life. I mean, we should be telling stories. That is, we should be hearing the old myths and hearing people tell them and telling them to each other, because stories grow as we tell them. They are a dynamic way in which connection is expressed and in which the dynamic of creation is expressed. So we should be telling stories consistently. We should be also consistently performing practices which recognize that I am part of something much vaster than myself, much older than myself, much older than the notions of this localized entity I call myself. Another way of saying that is we should be praying. And what are the different ways we can do that? What are the different, if we look back into our traditional answer, we had loads and loads and loads of different ways of doing that. How do we redo that? We begin to look at this question of finding practices, finding ways of finding motions, finding recognitions, finding systems of behavior that somehow enact our creative participation in creation itself. Call that sacred ritual. We should be doing that. We should be singing. Our voices are absolutely critical. We haven't been given voices merely to transact communication between each other. Our voices are much more than that. Birds don't sing just to demarcate their territories or to call a mate. Birds sing because there's a fundamental creative force that moves through them when they do that. That's true of absolutely everything. Whether it's a thundering waterfall, whether it's a roaring ocean, whether it's the wind howling through the trees, whether it's people getting together and talking, whether it's, it doesn't matter. So that's a function of our spirit. So as we vocalize, something magical happens. In the same way that when we pray, something magical happens. In the same way that when we tell stories, something magical happens. By magical, I mean something fundamentally creative that is feeding into the great creation, into creation itself, in a very profound and very, very important way. And we also have movement. And movement is also not just transactional. It's not just to get from one place to another. It's, movement is in the nature of our being. So when we begin to embrace movement, again, we're taking ourselves, and we could call this dance, we're taking ourselves into the dance of creation itself. And we can bring these recognitions of interconnectedness in as we do them. I'm dancing creation. I'm singing the sun into the sky. These are the things we used to do. And we, this was a profound understanding within us. It wasn't just a romantic idea. So these are all things we should be doing if we're going to be in service to the wholeness of who we are and into the total participation of who we are within creation itself. And we have the capacity to do all of those things fundamentally within us. You know, it's there. We don't necessarily need experts to tell us how to do that. We can rediscover it within ourselves. We can get together and co-create a rediscovery of that. And yes, it's helpful to have people who can guide us, who've done it before, who've said, you know, for the last 20 years, I've been exploring this, and let me show you what I've discovered. And then we can say, well, there's an elder, somebody who's been doing it for 20 years. If I've only been doing it for 6 months, you know, there's a relationship that can happen there. So this interaction of co-creation and learning through each other's experience is a fundament of being human as well. And we can rediscover that. We can bring that into being again. But we try to do it in the spirit of participation rather than the spirit of, I'm not sure what I want to call it now, but you know, there's this notion of kind of, I go to an elder and I receive knowledge. No, I go to an elder and I participate. And the elder participates. There's an interaction that takes place. And so if we can recreate that notion and kind of dissemble the idea of novice and expert to some extent, we begin to move back into that participatory notion of what ritual implies.
Brilliant. Thank you, Colin. I'd love to open it up for questions. I know that's a complete hurtle through ritual from Colin's tradition, and honestly, we could spend hours and years and decades unpacking this. But if you do have a question, do you want to put up your electronic hand, and we'll get to as many as possible. Colin, perhaps before we do that, Manon's just asking if you could just quickly say the 5 things once again. So it was storytelling, singing, dancing,
sacred ritual, and prayer.
Prayer. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Natalie, do you want to unmute yourself?
Have to convince my cat to get out of the way. I have a question. This is wonderful. This is just, oh my God, it's amazing. My question is, in the process of remembering who we really are, or who and how we once were, how important is it, or is it important at all, to try to go back, trace our own lineage back to times when our ancestors elsewhere, for most of us, were doing all of these 5 things together? Is that helpful? Is that critical?
Yeah, so well, definitely. I mean, traditional people here would say that's vital.
Okay.
However, in saying that it's vital, we have to be a little bit careful, because we might have a specific interpretation of what that means. That means, you know, I'm going to go back to my family tree and I'm going to log all the people that go back and find their names and figure out who they were and what they did. And that's a mammoth thing. So it's less about that, and it's more about developing a story of origin. How is it that I come to be here, and what leads back through my history? And that's a mythic story as much as anything. And by mythic, I mean it's dynamic. It's made up of all sorts of different, from an animist point of view, spirits. You know, it's the spirit of connectedness that goes through. So you know, a way of looking at it, I mean, here in Southern Africa, we divide the story of origin into 4 principal parts. So the first part is my family lineage. You know, who are my mother and father, and who were their mothers and fathers, and who were theirs and theirs and theirs, going back as far as I can remember. But I don't need to have a kind of a, you know, a final blueprint of thousands of people going back behind me. But what I have to have is a sense of that connectedness and a way of invoking that sense within myself. The other thing is, who lived on the land I live on now before me, both human and other. So who's buried in the soil from which I eat? So that's another whole area of origin, and it's a dynamic one, because we're eating constantly of that earth, in the same way that we're drawing constantly on our familial lineage, at least as far as our Western story is concerned, through our genetic encoding and so on. And then the next one is, who have been important in my life in terms of mentoring me? Who have I learned from? You know, so I had this person then, and I had the other person then. So that's another aspect of lineage. And then finally, what is my relationship with the natural world? Who are the trees? Who are the plants? Who are the rivers? Who are the mountains? And how do I relate to them? So through those four aspects, we create and we remember, perhaps more importantly, what we would refer to as the story of origin. The story of origin is absolutely vital. It's the way we essentially conduit connection. So recognizing that connection is already there, but that we can reaffirm it consistently by, in some way, mythically invoking the journey from there to here, and therefore also back there. Remembering also the etymology of the word remember, which is to remember, so bringing the members of ourselves back together again. So as we're doing this, we're pushing the boundaries of our localized sense of ourselves, of our isolated notion of ourselves back. And we're becoming more and more and more inclusive in the recognition that the totality of who I am is everything, and everything is who I am. And that's really connection in its ultimate form.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natalie. So we have 3 more questions. Let's see if we can get them in. We have about 10 minutes. Christine, would you like to unmute, please? Cindy, can I get you to unmute Christine? Perhaps if we go to Hazel first, then we'll come back to you next, Christine.
Hello.
Oh,
hi. Yeah, it wasn't letting me unmute, but then I was invited to unmute and then it worked.
Great, brilliant.
So yeah, thanks so much. This is great. I just wanted to pick up on this thing about achievement and perfectionism and striving that you talked about. And I'm curious about everything that you're talking about. How can we go into that? Like, I can see how I personally could easily go into everything you're talking about, and want to kind of strive to feel this. You talked about instead of needing to get somewhere, it's just remembering, right? Remembering something instead. But within me, I feel this, you can strive to remember. I feel immediately a sense of wanting to achieve remembering. I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that whenever we look back on these practices and these ways and these ideas of what we have had about ourselves, we will tend to project our present view of creation and our relationship with creation onto it. So indeed, as we look at them, it becomes potentially another form of striving. And that's so one way around that is, first of all, to dissemble the rationale for why we're doing something first, and simply start doing things. So, you know, literally simply going out there and singing to the sun or singing to the moon, utilizing the voice and bringing it back into, you know, singing to the land, singing with the land, emulating the birds, you know, getting into an almost childlike remembrance of that, because our childlike nature is very close to that part of ourselves that, you know, stretches back into the very earliest parts of what being human means. In the same way, you know, dancing, moving, finding ways of creatively allowing a kind of a free rein approach to exploration, re-establishing a relationship with rambunctious exploration. I think these are some of the ways we can, certainly these were some of the ways that I was taught, you know, here in the traditions here. They just say to you, listen, tonight you're going to go and sit in the cave of ancestors. And I would say, but why am I going to go and sit in the cave of ancestors? No, but you just are. Just go and do it. And then I go and sit in the cave of ancestors, you know, and it's a long and freezing cold night, and the hyenas are moaning outside, and It's terrifying in just about every sense of the word. And I come out the next day, and the elder who was working with me says, "So, you sat in the cave of the ancestors?" And I say, "Yes." And they say, "What did you see?" And I say, "I don't know that I saw very much. It was very dark." "What did you feel?" "I felt frightened." "What did you hear?" "I heard the hyena." And no further explanation is given. But then 3 months later, it's like, "Okay, you're going to go and sit in the cave of ancestors again." So I go and sit in the cave of ancestors again, expecting the same experience, and I have pretty much the same experience. This happens again and again and again. And then over time, something starts to happen. And it happens almost in spite of me. The questioning aspect of me is kind of eventually grows bored because I'm not going to get answers. And the part of me that wants drama and wants something remarkable and miraculous to happen because I'm sitting in the cave of ancestors also gets bored and abandons me. And it's then that something starts happening. It's then that the so-called magic starts to seep in, and recognitions start to percolate into my awareness that have nothing to do with understanding. They operate on a completely different level. So the one thing I can say about ritual, and the one thing I can say about these practices, is do them again and again and again and again and again. Repetition is a fundament of ritual. That is a very important notion. And I'm speaking here about ritual practice in the ongoing sense. There are rituals here and there that are one-off, but all of them are based in preparation of repetition. So coming back, coming back, coming back, coming back, and each time disrobing yourself of expectation, disrobing. You see, the other problem that we sit with in this striving way that we've kind of set ourselves up now is we believe that something is only valuable if it's dramatic and if it has profound impact on us. And so that's the expectation we go into something like ritual with. It's like, well, if I don't come out of there and go, wow, something happened there, it didn't work. It wasn't ritual. And then we go immediately into deficit. Obviously I haven't perfected this thing enough. I need to rethink it, and I need to begin my striving all over again. And I need to look at perfection out there and re-navigate my way in terms of it. So the task is each time to try and drop that. Drop the need for the drama, drop the need for something, anything to happen, drop the need to understand why you're doing it and to need to explain to anyone else why you're doing it. Just do it. And then do it again, and do it again, and do it again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christine. Hazel. So we've got 2 more questions. Hazel. Cindy. Struggling with our unmuting tonight.
Unmuting. It's very pertinent to what we're talking about. To unmute ourselves.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll go for it.
Everyone, good to be here. Thank you so much for this conversation. There's one thing I think I didn't hear talking about, and my understanding is that rituals are also like born of and in relationship with the land they are practiced on. And so, I mean, to me, from what I understand and what I observe, they are really a co-creation between humanity and the land. And so how would you talk about the importance of like remembering, yeah, how to listen to the land that is under our feet in order to really hear the rituals that are needed for our times?
Yes.
I don't know. You talked about that, talking about the child.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. So, a way of understanding this is that, the land, the place where you are is constantly interacting with us. So where I come from in Botswana, for example, there's certain winds that come from the south at certain times of year. There's certain winds that come from the north at certain times of year. The sun moves north in winter and comes south in summer. If we go far enough south, we hit the ocean. If we go far enough north, we hit the forests of Central Africa. And then there are hills and there are mountains. But what we immediately begin to experience in that is that the place has all these different voices, if you like, which are in some way coming into and being part of my experience. I can feel the wind blow in August when it's dry, when it's very filled with static, when it's come all the way across. It's blown all the way from Antarctica across the Namib Desert and into Botswana. And by the time it gets to Botswana, it's a dry wind. It's a static wind. And because of its dryness and because of the staticness in it, it brings dry electric storms at that time of year. And then at some point in the season, the wind does a 180-degree turn and starts blowing from the north. And to the north of us, of course, are the equatorial regions and the intertropical zone of convergence. And what happens then is it brings warm, moist air down into Botswana, which meets the cold, dry winds that have been blowing thus far. And immediately we begin to get frontal rain. So we understand that our rains come from the north, but that they are somehow fundamentally influenced and generated by the south. Now we have a whole mythic story for that. Who are the winds from the south? And how are they distinct from the winds of the north? So we then begin to understand them in an animist way. They are spirits, they are alive, they are interactive, and they can be interacted with. So as we plan our rituals, we say, okay, let's take account of the fact that the winds from the south, which seem to be infertile, which seem to be dry, they don't have rain in them, somehow interact with the winds of the north, which are permeated, filled with this sense of providence and possibility. But it's only in the conjoining of the two that we get rain. So how do we understand that in ritual terms? If we want to enact that in ritual terms, how do we reconstruct that in order to help that happen, recognizing that Botswana is a place which has drought? So if I'm a maker of rain and I'm practicing rituals around that, those two winds are extremely important, and so are those two directions. We recognize that to the north is the sense of fertility and possibility. To the south is the sense of activation and amplification. So the winds of the south amplify things. The winds of the north give birth to things. How do we conjoin those in ritual terms? How can we be creative about that? What can we do? Do we create a circle and we say, okay, this is the north part of the circle, that's the south part of the circle, this is the cycle of the seasons, the sun, the moon. How do we enact that? Because in enacting it, we're co-creating within it, and we're bringing it into the greater possibility that unhindered, that's what's going to happen during the course of the year. So that's kind of an example, if you like, in a very, very simple sense of where we are and what is happening in the place that we are deeply and profoundly influences the manner in which we construct ritual practice.
I think you make a lovely point there as well, Hazel, about the conversational reciprocity part of ritual, in that we're also giving ourselves. So that's a note in the chat, and we've got about -30 seconds, so if we could do a quick question and then a quick answer, and then I'll be able to let you go pretty much on time. So pirate lilac pants, I've been dying to say that for the last 15 minutes. What's your question, please?
That's actually not my code name, but hello, Colin and everybody else. I've got to ask a very quick question. I'm a gardener. I'm very new to this, but I'm absolutely becoming entrenched. And my question is to do with the land and about who's lived on it before and who's buried there, and the fact that we eat from it, and what the significance of that is and how we should be thinking about that. It's a really fascinating idea.
It's a profound question. I mean, of course, the problem we immediately find ourselves in is that most of what we eat doesn't come from the land that we live on. So we're eating of, here in Southern Africa at any rate, oranges from Spain and avocados from Guatemala and so on and so forth. And traditional people here say that's having very profound impact on us. But another way of looking at that might be to say, well, that's also beginning to create, and we've got this new again, probably unprecedented notion of being a global conscious. We're a globe now. And so the land we eat from is the earth herself. And we are tasked essentially with transiting into an awareness of ourselves in global rather than local terms. So for me, there's both a difficulty, a hurdle in this, because we are now feeling kind of pulled way over the horizons of what we would normally have been contained within. And yet at the same time, we have this image that has come back to us since the early 60s of the earth on which we live, and the notion of being having a global existence. So that's how we begin to think of it. We begin to think of, we eat from the earth, and that connects us inextricably to the earth. Every time we're eating something, we're eating of those who lived on the earth before us. Of course, we've got to expand ourselves massively now. It's no longer just southeastern Botswana, where I happen to grow up. It's now the entire planet. But I think this is one of the transitions as a collective that we're in at the moment. If we look at it as a psychomythic point of view, our whole mythos is changing, and we are now in the mythos of being an Earth, a globe within a solar system, and I think that's a very different thing. But basically, the principle still remains the same. Who are we eating of as we eat, and how do we begin to relate to that in a mythic sense? What does our story of the time now look like, or need to look like? And the honest answer to that right now is we don't really know. What we know is we need a story, and we need a functional story. And what we also know is that most of the stories we once had about what being human meant are not enough anymore. We've got to expand the story. We've got to recreate the story to represent who we have become now.
Thank you. That's amazing.
Thank you, Pirate Lilac Pants. Brilliant. Thank you all so much. That's been a complete rattle through. I will just do a couple of shout outs. So Colin is going to be doing some ritual work online next year. So if you're interested in joining us for that, then just keep an eye on our website or join the newsletter. He's also coming next summer to do a residential here in the UK on one of his fairly rare visits. So again, go and check that out. That's live now. Next week, we have Mancan McGann coming to speak to us about Irish myth and magic. And I'm noticing there's been some talk in the chat about language. So for anybody interested in language, myth and magic, then this time next week will be a good time to come again. And also to say our winter solstice ceremony will be ritual work at the solstice in this country using some of the traditions that are here at the moment. So please come along for that. So thank you so much, Colin, as always. And sorry we've crammed you into an hour, which doesn't seem right really, but it's been really rich. And you'll all get the recording so you can go back through and pick through some of those things that were said. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and hope to see you really soon.